Hello, my name is Max Mowdy, and I am with Texas Reach Network. Joining me today is Tom McNulty, a principal with ValueScope, Inc., and Jack Belcher, a principal officer with Cornerstone Government Affairs, Inc. We're going to be discussing a topic that is very important to companies both in Texas and across the United States. The topic is called ESG, and these three letters stand for environment, social, and governance. Most companies understand the importance of the environment. They certainly understand the importance of how their business relates to society and people. And they also understand the importance that their business must have rules of ethics and rules of conduct and do certain things and not do other things. And they voluntarily do this on a day-to-day basis. But now there are groups and investors and stakeholders in the companies that are insisting or at least urging their companies to formalize their ESG policies. And this gives rise to questions that these companies now have with respect to how they're going to do that. For instance, questions will ask, well, how do I define ESG in terms of my business and my customers? They're also going to be asking the question, if I do implement a policy with respect to ESG, how am I going to measure the effect that ESG is having both externally and internally on my company? And then the third question they're going to be asking and are asking is, if I put an ESG policy in place and I'm able to come up with a framework which allows me to measure the effect of ESG, can I put a monetary value on my ESG policies? These are complicated questions facing companies, and we have two gentlemen joining us today who have the expertise and the knowledge to help clarify for companies exactly what they need to consider with respect to ESG and making it a part of their daily business. Thank you for joining me today and to join us to talk about this thing that I'll call ESG. I think it would be very helpful perhaps to start with a little bit of history about ESG and how it came to be what appears to be very important to companies in Texas and in the U.S. today.
Sure. Well, ESG is a concept that is new in terms of its name, but it's been around for a while. Over the history, companies have taken their responsibility to the public, to their shareholders, to different stakeholders more seriously. And over time, companies have been increasingly judged by their performance in these areas. So ESG has come about because investors now value those types of performances for companies, how they treat the environment, how they disclose, whether it's things like emissions or other factors that are important, how transparent they are, who sits on their board, what are the policies and procedures that are in place, how do they mitigate risk. And environment, social governance is a term that has emerged over the past few years and is now more clearly defined. Companies are now judged and measured by their ESG performance, and increasingly it has become a factor in investment funds making decisions about who to invest in, and it's become a factor in companies judging whether to acquire an organization. So it's playing a role now in mergers and acquisitions. So over time now, the science behind ESG is becoming more defined. There's still a lot of room for definition, and a lot of people think that there needs to be more standardization in ESG, but it has emerged quite significantly over the past few years. And a topic that few people knew about 2 or 3 years ago, everybody's talking about today.
Is this something that arose out of social investing? You remember when that became sort of a buzzword in the financial community was, well, let's invest in a company that does X, Y, Z because it helps the environment in some manner. Is this an extension to some degree of that?
It is an extension of that, but it's more. It's actually, there's proof now. We know that how companies perform in these areas is directly related to their financial performance. Because companies that are paying attention to these ESG factors, that are in the top quartile or top performers in these factors, are also going to be more apt to run more responsible programs and processes within those companies. And more likely to be mitigating risks, external risks that can have big impacts on a company's performance.
So that's a good reason with respect to measuring ESG. I've always been interested in whether you describe ESG as an initiative, a policy, a practice. How do you describe it?
I'm glad you brought up the notion of measuring, because a lot of disruptive things in the world happen at certain times when certain things come together. And we're also in an era of big data. People use the term big data analytics. There's a lot of digitization. So the notion that you can count things, that you can quantify items that may in the past have been considered vague, intangible, kind of challenging to count, that is now more and more possible. So when you bring up the term measure, we're in a period of time now in the 21st century where a lot of the factors, maybe not all, but a lot of the factors that go into an ESG assessment can be measured after they are defined.
Is this something that is primarily focused in the United States right now, or is this a global initiative or effort or to make ESG in effect a part of the daily life of a company?
Yeah, Jack will probably be able to speak to this in more depth. When I say global, it's certainly United States and certainly Western Europe, or maybe all of Europe. And you've seen this with some of your clients.
Absolutely. Very strong in Europe, increasingly strong in the United States and North America, but also in Latin America. I've had conversations just this week with folks about ESG performance in Latin America. We're seeing more and more companies globally take into account these ESG factors, putting together full-blown ESG programs, and actually getting out there and putting reports out, touting their ESG performance. Companies that operate in a global environment have to perform, against their peers, and their peers are all over the world. So we're seeing more and more emphasis on this as a global phenomenon, and we expect that to continue into the future.
One of the things that I'm very curious about is the frameworks that the ESG policies and the ESG practices are being put into in order to be able to measure their effect and do the other things that a company needs to do when it decides to adopt ESG to make it part of its day-to-day business. Building frameworks, it seems to me that there are many groups that are building frameworks or proposing frameworks and proposing to companies that they use certain frameworks. Is it ultimately going to be consolidated into one or two frameworks, or because there's so many out there, how is that not confusing to a company as to what framework they want to adopt in order to implement ESG in their company?
Well, these are early days, I know, and Jack, you're familiar with several of them. I have spent most of my time focused more on the so-called SASB framework based out of San Francisco. It sounds like FASB, it's the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, and that's one of the frameworks and concepts that has emerged over the last couple of years, but there are others. You're right. The main thing is, without standardization, there's an element of vagueness to it. And so, one of the things that we're trying to preach and practice is define, measure, value. So define the framework, define the ESG framework, determine how you can measure it and then value it. But there are others other than SASB.
There are several frameworks, and it is daunting for companies to figure out where they want to emphasize, what do they want to use. Over time, we think that those frameworks are going to be consolidating some. They already are. And they're going to be improving because in the beginning, the people that developed the frameworks were developing the frameworks for the companies to use. Now, the input is coming from the industries that are being that the frameworks are going to be about. So when you get more input from the actual industries, the practitioners, then you get a better framework. And so that's improving over time. Consolidation is improving over time. There are forces out there that are trying to further consolidate. Companies can make their own decisions. This is not a mandatory thing right now. In some cases, it's mandatory if you want to get investment capital, but it's not a mandatory thing yet. So companies can make their own decisions about what frameworks they use, and it's often a combination of frameworks, how they want to emphasize their performance, because it's important that a company emphasizes the things that are important to them and to their shareholders. And then companies make decisions on how they're going to improve their performance over time. So these are commitments that companies make as part of this process.
It may be that right now that one size framework doesn't fit all situations. And it kind of comes into a question that I've got with respect to, well, how does a company really determine whether or not it should adopt ESG policies and procedures? Does it depend on the business that they're in, the industry that they're in, or is this something that's going to cover multiple industry sectors? And again, it's just down to the company as to which framework they adopt to try to measure and define and other things with respect to ESG.
I think when you're looking at the situation right now, companies are looking at different frameworks as a way to satisfy investor demands, right? I mean, a lot of this is investor driven. So the decisions that companies make are, in the beginning, largely done to satisfy their investors, to satisfy capital markets. Over time, companies are finding that using ESG frameworks enables them to get better control over their internal processes, to ensure that they're complying with their own internal standards. It also helps on the regulatory side. It helps them with their relationship with stakeholders. They have a way to demonstrate their performance that's becoming a more of an actionable, demonstratable way to show their performance. And over time, it's being seen as a risk management tool. It's helping companies identify where their risks potentially are, mitigate those risks, and demonstrate to investors, to regulators, to other stakeholders that they're performing, that they're reducing those risks, and that they're a better performing company.
Yeah, and it definitely applies to all industries. I mean, it's a concept that's not unique to a particular industry. So the concepts within ESG can apply across just about everything, if not everything. I think just being here in Houston, we're both primarily energy professionals. And so the thing about the energy complex is there's a bigger impact with the E, the first letter, because you have, you're in the hydrocarbon stream, you're in the sustainability world, clean energy, renewable energy, fossil fuels, that whole aspect is a big part of E. It dominates the E part of ESG. So there is a bigger impact. There's more bang for the buck for ESG work in the energy complex because you can have a program that has a very big impact. Other types of companies and other industries will implement it and should, and the impact will be real and measurable. But what's different about energy is it's dramatically larger.
Do you see this ESG policies? Do you see them, or do you see regulatory agencies deciding sometime in the near future or far future that we need to make ESG a part of our regulatory policies, as opposed to companies just voluntarily putting in place ESG policies? As Jack, I think you said, that's what they do now. They don't have to do this, but it's something that because of their stakeholders, their investors, their customers, and everybody are starting to look at companies and saying, well, we think ESG is a good idea and what it stands for, so you need to do this. Again, companies just do it voluntarily. Back to my question was, do you see regulatory agencies starting to say, well, maybe we need to write this into the regs or rules that apply to this company or industry?
I mean, it's probably early days for that, and the regulatory structures can take a while. But if you think of companies doing it now, there's a first mover advantage to it. But even when you have two big events, in the last 2 decades, you had Sarbanes-Oxley and then the whole Dodd-Frank situation. There were companies that were probably compliant before those statutes. In other words, you have companies that can be doing things before it becomes mandatory. But I am not aware of anything moving. We just went through an election, so I don't think there's anything I can think of where it's happening now. Which jurisdiction would it be? Would it be FASB? Would it be SEC for energy companies? Is it FERC? There's so many different regulatory bodies, and then globally, how would you do it? Maybe it's the UN, but so far it's early days, right? I mean, there's no one.
It is early days, but there's a lot going on. Yeah. And Tom is right to point to Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley. These are laws that were enacted to react to things that took place in the market, and so there are a couple of ways this can play out. One, there's regulatory creep, and that is. The SEC is already looking at ESG, and it's wondering whether or not the way companies are stating things need to be better clarified. Do they need to step in and say, there are certain standards for what you say, what you put out there? So there's that. There's legislative possibilities. There was legislation in some of there was draft legislation in some of the spending bills that took place for the rescue on the COVID rescue bills this last summer that would have required companies that received some of that aid to have disclosures on climate-related disclosures. So that's an ESG factor. We've had hearings in the House during the last session on ESG where this whole notion of having more standardization was discussed. So there are things that are taking place, and I think you're going to see under a new administration a more focus on ESG. So it can happen through increased regulatory pressure. It can happen through legislation. Legislation is often passed when there's a crisis or perceived crisis. So external factors can play a role in all that. So there's a number of different ways. And then as you mentioned, there's international pressure. Europe's doing certain things. When U.S. companies are on the same playing field as European companies, how this plays out internationally, that's also a driving force over time.
Does this apply to publicly owned and privately owned companies equally?
That's a good question. I typically, when there is a change, a big change like this, it starts at the public SEC registrant level for a variety of reasons, but that's generally where it starts, and then it sort of moves into the private space. Although we're working with clients now that are private that are talking about this. So it's not that there's a large gap between the two, but if there's going to be a legislative, statutory, regulatory element, that's naturally going to start with the publicly traded companies, because that's just the way it works with the federal law around securities. But again, it's not something we're not advocating to our clients. If you're private, don't worry about this for another 50 years. No, not really. I mean, it's very much here now. And when you articulate the argument that it's a positive NPV concept, I mean, when you're forced to do something, you do it, and people grumble, and you have regulations, statutory frameworks, fine. But when you can articulate something that is a positive NPV concept for shareholders, for the company, lowering risk, however you want to define, measure, and value it, then you don't have to wait for it to be statutory. You don't have to wait till you're public. You may do it while you're a private company, and then it may become easier for you to become a public company.
Yeah, ESG frameworks force discipline.
Yeah.
And because they force discipline, they are liked by boards. And if a company has a goal and it's a lofty goal, it's going to be maybe not on the front and center. It's not going to be the first thing that a company approaches. But when a company makes commitments, when it puts out commitments that it's going to meet certain metrics, then that's a game changer, especially when it does it publicly. So ESG is not just done by public companies, although they tend to be, much more public companies are doing it now. They're being done by companies that are either aspiring to be public companies one of these days, or that are trying to achieve certain goals for their investors. And because ESG performance drives other types of performance, it's being seen more and more by investors and boards and senior management as a way to improve overall performance.
Is the pressure coming from more outside the company than inside the company? And if it's outside the company, and the pressure is coming from investors, are there types of groups that seem to be trying to pressure companies more than others to get involved in ESG?
You're seeing with certainly the school, the large endowments, a lot of the universities. So these so-called buy-side private capital funds, more and more movement to divest of investments that don't meet certain thresholds that are ESG or sustainability thresholds, private capital players, and that varies. There are probably private capital funds that may not focus on that, but it's growing. Pension funds. So the whole capital side is as a big driver of it. We're starting to even see it maybe trickle into banking a little bit, where regulated large banks have to take a look at their portfolios, their loan portfolios, and those questions are coming from, or I've seen it, they're coming from the boards. That's a little early. That's a little bit newer, but the pensions, the endowments, the big PE firms, that's here already. I mean, that's already happening.
I would presume also professional advisors to companies are also trying to become familiar with ESG.
Mm-hmm.
The attorneys and other groups. I mean, they're going to try to figure out what this is all about.
There's a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
A lot of those folks who are trying to get their arms around what it means, get their arms around how it factors into their decisions, how they can demonstrate to the market that they A, understand it, and B, are utilizing their understanding of it to drive decision making.
Yeah.
So all of those things are happening now.
And there's new. I was on a call last week, and a term I had not heard of, which was ESG philanthropy, where it was the whole another area of capital, private capital, the family office world, which in the United States is actually very big. It is around the world, but there's a lot of capital in the family office space. And this was a situation where basically the investor, this buy side is looking for investments that are either ESG, sustainability, or both. I mean, they can be mixed together from almost a philanthropy standpoint, but it can still be a positive NPV thing. So it's basically, I want a certain amount of my portfolio in assets and investments that can be called ESG investments. And so that'll start to pick up. It already has, but that just came out of nowhere last week.
Before we discuss further things with respect to measuring ESG and valuation and these other things that do apply to ESG policies and practices, let me ask you a little bit about yourselves and your companies. Jack, can you tell us, where you grew up and went to school, and a little bit about Cornerstone?
Sure. So I grew up right here in Houston, Texas. Went to high school right down the road at Lamar High School. Went to the University of Texas in Austin, and then came back to Houston after college and worked in Texaco in the newly deregulated gas market. Ended up in Washington, D.C. for about 12 years, where I was with Hart Publications, Hart Energy, and at the Independent Petroleum Association of America, and then was the staff director for the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee in the House of Representatives. That's the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over oil and gas and mining. And went from there back home to Houston to Shell, and then went out into the consulting world over 10 years ago. I've been with Cornerstone for almost 2 years. Cornerstone is a government relations firm, but also is in communications and business advisory and other practices. It's one of the larger firms in the government relations world. It's based in Washington, D.C., but has offices around the country in, I believe, we're in 10 or 11 states now. So we have state government relations, federal government relations as well. And in our practice here, we do ESG work. We do other advisory services to companies, risk assessment, issues management, and government relations. And our clients are primarily in the energy space, but we're doing ESG work across different industry verticals. So it's not limited to energy. I've just focused mostly on energy in my career.
Tom?
Well, my father's a naval officer, so I grew up moving quite a bit. Points between Key West, Florida, and Newport, Rhode Island, and everything in between. I wound up at Yale University. I studied history and Russian. Started my career on Wall Street in banking, but I had an opportunity to enter the Foreign Service. So a commissioned Foreign Service officer. I was stationed in Southeast Asia, former Soviet Union, and in Washington. And it was in Washington where I got the energy bug. I actually was assigned as a staff officer in an energy policy office. I read Jurgen's book, The Prize, and that was it. I mean, I was interested in energy from that point on. Went to Northwestern for my MBA, wound up in Houston in '96. I worked for several large energy companies, Duke Energy, Plains All American, Enron International. And in the advisory part of my career, it's very much focused on transaction work, litigation and dispute work, and complex valuation work. My firm, ValueScope, is a boutique advisory firm. Our offices are in Dallas and Houston. And we focus on economic analysis, financial consulting, and valuation of things that are hard to value, basically.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And we know that you're, as you say, you've been working now with ESG for quite some time and seen it evolve. Who do you think at a company should be responsible for ESG policies and procedures, other than after the company decides that yes, we want to put in place an ESG policy? Who should be in charge of that?
Yeah, we've both touched on. I mean, it's sometimes the touch points vary, right? Government affairs could be the C-suite that could come from the boards.
Investor relations. I mean, the interesting thing about ESG is it touches all aspects of a company across the different business lines. It goes across the different functions in an organization. But ultimately, ESG belongs at the very top, because this is, when you're making a commitment here, you're committing your entire organization to meeting performance standards. And in order for that to be effective, in order for that to be successful, it has to be managed at the very top of the organization. So ultimately, the boards, the C-suite, they have to be on top of what's going on. They have to be committed to making it work. There has to be uniformity in terms of understanding what those commitments are, how they're going to meet them, who is ultimately accountable, who's responsible for making them happen. It's really at the top, and it's very interesting, because in some ways it's a way that organizations can unify themselves around certain goals and objectives. It has a very interesting impact in kind of helping organizations unify themselves under a common structure.
Do you think it's a good idea to outsource initially the work, simply because there's usually no one within the organization or the company that probably knows, well, what's the first thing we do?
There's a natural place for independence and third-party assessments. Plenty of work can be done internally, and it can be taught internally, but if you look at the comps, so to speak, if you think of Sarbanes-Oxley, if you think of Dodd-Frank, where, at least in the initial phase, outside expertise was often used, because you want to thread the needle where, you're declaring your metrics and your achievements in a defined ESG program, but who's checked it, right? Is it ultimately going to be part of an audit? Maybe before that, though, is an outside party able to independently confirm it? I think there's value in independence, particularly given that we don't have exact specified definitions. If you think of define, measure, value, if it's still early days and you don't have an exact rule, who is the arbiter? And I think there's definitely a role for the third party to independently design the program, assess the program.
You asked a question earlier about where the touch points are, who owns it. Well, there are turf wars in companies over who owns this, and it's very interesting. What we have learned is that you have to put structures inside of organizations, in corporations, that help everyone have a say in ESG. So you need to create an organization, whether it's a board of some sort within an ESG committee structure, that helps to ensure that the different parts of the organization are weighing in. So one thing that an outside third party can do is help you manage through that, because there is I spoke earlier about it being a unifying thing. It can also be a source of tension. It can also be a source of friction. So having an outside party come in and help set things up in a more equitable manner can be valuable to an organization. It's also true that people don't have time to learn all this stuff. So a little learning is a dangerous thing, and if your understanding of ESG is only an inch, and you need a mile, then that you're not going to do yourself any favors. So I think it's important to have an organization come in that kind of understands the soup to nuts, whole process about how you put an ESG program together, how you prioritize things, and every organization needs to put their own priorities in place based on a lot of different criteria. And then how do you make it happen? How do you make it happen? How do you report it? And then finally, if you're not communicating it, and you're not communicating it well, then why are you doing it? So there's that aspect to it as well. So it's important to have, I think, some experts from outside an organization come in and help put it together. And then ultimately you learn, just like anything else, how to keep it going internally.
Assuming your company and its board and its executive officers and owners have decided to adopt ESG policies and procedures, how are they going to measure the effect ESG policies are having internally at the company or externally outside the company? What tools are available for that? Can you go into that just a little bit? Because when we first began our discussion, we were talking a lot about measuring the effect of ESG on a company. Tell us a little bit about measuring, and again, the tools available and the metrics behind that.
Well, one of the reasons we're in a strategic alliance is our firms are complementary. We do very different things, and we add the skill sets together, then you have the total product. So we can start with, you've completed studies, Jack, recently that probably cover, the define measure type frameworks, and then I could touch on some measurement examples that I've worked on, and then the valuation piece. But it's start before measurement, of course, it's define it. And done a lot of work in that.
Yes, and there are frameworks, as you mentioned, out there that help with that. The definitions that help you define what it is, and they exist. You have flexibility, though, as you're developing your program on what it is you want to measure, and there are ways to measure it that are part of frameworks. You can also have your own internal ways of measuring what you're doing. Ultimately, what you want to do is measure where you are. This is pretty simple. Measure where you are, measure where you want to be, and figure out how you're going to get there and how you demonstrate that you're there. And that's really the important part of it. Sometimes we get a little bit too wrapped up in kind of exactly what it is, but once we get there, we're able to define it and then ultimately measure what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one of the ways to measure the effect ESG may have on a company is how it has to do with the valuation of the company. I mean, they sort of work hand in glove, and I'll try to measure it. Well, once I've got it measured, can I actually value that measurement or value the effect of ESG from a monetary standpoint, whether it's for regulatory reporting or an M&A transaction or whatever? So could you talk a little bit about that?
This is where our partnership comes into play. You can measure the way that you perform vis-a-vis your competitors, right? You can be you can have a certain score and compare it to your competitors. But what does that actually mean? What is the value? And Tom and I started talking about this some time ago. Is there a way that you can actually show what that value is? And that's not my area of expertise. That's Tom's area of expertise, and that's how this all came about. Is we started talking about why that's important.
We think the answer is definitely yes, and we think it's important also because it prevents what's called greenwashing. When something is too soft, it's not really defined or measured, then it can be glossy but not have substance. And when you move something to dollars, that changes the argument quite a bit. We also think there's some symmetry to it. This is the 100th anniversary of really the birth of the valuation profession. If you think of a government action or an externality prohibition, it was enacted, the Volstead Act in the United States. You had lots and lots of businesses that had their value destroyed. Restaurants, bars, etc. And up until that time, value was done largely through tangible concepts. The tables, the chairs, the physical plant was value. And at that time, notions of intangible value were introduced and overall business value. And so 100 years later, we're still doing it. And there are techniques that, we would argue you're not reinventing the wheel. You can assess intangible value using techniques that have been around for a long time and simply assess certain intangible value around ESG. If you think of brands, trade names, know-how, customer lists, things that are considered normal intangible assets, there are ways that they're valued that are accepted under GAAP application accepted by the IRS. And so these techniques can be used looking at specific ESG programs, contracts, frameworks. Top down is even probably easier, where you're simply looking at a company across the business enterprise and changing the risk. Anyone in the valuation world, investing world, banking world understands cost of capital, things like beta and alpha. These are elements that have also been around a long time. So there's no reinvention or creation of something new. Adjusting these metrics changes the value of a particular business in relation to its comps or its peers. And those are techniques that are used today anyway. And you're simply bringing ESG elements into those concepts, and you can get to dollar amounts. A good example, if you think of scorecards or scoring systems have a lot of value, but they're not usually measured in terms of dollars. But you can use these concepts to get to a value concept, a dollar concept. Once you start talking in those terms, it becomes very, very real to investors, boards, shareholders. It becomes real because you show that it's a positive NPV concept, and then the investment will go into ESG programs, and you're off to the races then.
Is ESG something that's here to stay, or is this just something that you think will be at the forefront for a few years and then go away?
It's here to stay.
It's hard to imagine a scenario where it went away, because it's really being driven by the way society values performance, and because ESG performance is so linked to financial performance, it's not one of these things that's just nice to have. It actually improves your overall performance, and because investment entities are so focused and increasingly focused on ESG performance, it really seems like it's something that's here to stay. What is likely to happen is it's just not going to be so unique in the future. It's not going to be as novel, because it's already becoming less novel. It's becoming more part of everyday life. But it's like other things, it's going to be a part of normal business, and I think will be just one of those things that everybody knows that they have to do and succeed in. One of those factors.
Yeah, if anything, it can penetrate, as we touched on earlier. Most of the gravity is in Western Europe, United States, North America, and Jack's working some interesting things in South America. But there's a whole planet out there where there's still a lot of room to grow these concepts in the developing world, other parts of the globe where it's a newer concept. It's still relatively new here, but it's even newer in some of these other areas.
And I think, when you see the way investors and corporate executives in other parts of the world are viewing this, they want to know. There are programs right now in other parts of the world where they're fascinated with ESG. And in many cases, they're a lot further along than you might expect. Sustainability reports, for instance, are something that that has been part of the ESG evolution. They're all over the world now, and so ESG performance is now being judged all over the world. So it's here to stay, and it's a global phenomenon.
Well, gentlemen, we really do appreciate you spending the time with us today to go into ESG. I know that you have published and written a white paper explaining in much more detail ESG, your work in that area, your information, which some of our viewers may be interested in receiving, and others may be interested in calling you. So if you would not mind telling us how we could contact you to get a copy, of the white paper regarding ESG and valuation, or just pick up the phone and give you a call or email you. If you wouldn't mind sharing that with us, we would appreciate it. Tom?
Sure. T. McNulty at ValueScopeInc.com. Happy to send it out. Our names are on it with a third colleague, and happy to share it and talk about the topic. We're very energized by it, so we always happy to talk to people about it, even if it's an initial call, and look forward to receiving emails and inquiries.
What is your phone number, Tom?
It is 832-472-3717.
And then again, please, was what?
832-472-3717.
Thank you. Jack, your phone.
Email J Belcher, Belcher, at cgagroup.com. And my number is 713-494-2427.
Again, thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today and to talk about ESG.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate the interest.
Well, thank you for watching our program this afternoon. I would very much appreciate your comments on the program, and you could send those to me. My email address is max@texasreachnetwork.com. Again, thank you for watching, and you have a good day.